Hello, welcome back to Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Peter, and we are here to fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. And here's the one we're going to fall in love with today. So what shall we talk about? Let's talk about driving the streets of Wellington, New Zealand for a second. So I have never been a left side driver before. I've actually only been a driver for 5 or 6 years now. I got my license when we moved to the suburbs, and I realized I couldn't just kind of walk everywhere anymore. So I was fairly confident that I was going to be able to adapt my driving skills here. Really, the only part of driving that still is hard for me, although you have to think that like most people in America get their driver's license at like 16 or 17, so I'm really the equivalent of like a 24-year-old as a driver. The only thing that's really hard for me is like spatial skills. I'm not a big spatial reasoning person. Like, I can't tell you like what shape can fit behind me to fill up the shelf here, so I'm not a great parallel parker. So we got a car when we got to Wellington, and it has a backup camera. So I'm like, I'm set. My one problem, which is backing up the car, is fixed because I can see behind it. And the left side driving, not so hard. Like, I was so proud. My wife, when she drove for the first week, just so I could like get used to it, because she got her license like normal Americans at 16 or 17, so has been driving for like over a decade more than me. She kept like using the windshield wiper when she meant to use the turn signal, and vice versa, because then the opposite side and you're on the other side of the car. And like, having watched her do that for a week, I didn't make that mistake. The thing is though, the challenge here is not just left side driving. You know, which I've gotten a really good handle on. I think I've only driven on the wrong side of the road twice so far in a few months. It's, the challenge here is that Wellington, even though it's a relatively new city compared to Philadelphia, where I came from, which was like a city grid that was built in the 1600s originally, Wellington, the grid is insane. The streets are tiny, and they're hills that feel like just almost vertical roller coasters at points. So I have been coming down a hill that is meant to be two-way, where I can't even figure out how to fit my car down one way, and there's another car coming towards me. And sometimes you think like, okay, well, the people here know how to navigate this, and they'll kind of signal, they'll do like the little like you me thing. But sometimes on this one street that I'm thinking of, I remember like sticking my head out the window and being like, what are we supposed to do? And the woman's like, I have no idea. And I was like, I think there's enough curb for me. And you just have to like negotiate. And what's really interesting is how much of driving is negotiating here. I come from Philadelphia, which is one of the, in many definitions, meanest cities in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, you just get yours when it comes to driving. Like, you just get out in front of the other car, and sure enough, you just do the thing that you gotta do. In Wellington, there's this constant dance of reciprocation with other cars. Like in roundabouts, there's no stop sign or anything. You're just supposed to gauge, is the person from the right going to hit you? Yes or no? Okay, you might have time to get out. And I think it's the same thing with like going up and down the streets. And at the beginning, I think I was annoying people because I was so quick to do stuff, because that was my Philly driver coming out of like, just get into that, get in there. Not that I was the kind of person who like ran lights or like went through stop signs, because I actually try to drive like a grandmother and I'm assiduously rollerblading. But, you know, you still are used to dealing with the circumstances in Philly. And so over the past couple of months, I've kind of like mellowed, and now I know how to do the dance with the other drivers in Wellington. This is a hunk of classic right here. This is the complete X-Men Age of Apocalypse. There he is, his big grumpy cat face right there. This is a story that I have completely in floppies, and probably one of my most read sets of floppies of all time, honestly. Wow, so much to say. Okay, first let me explain the concept, then I'll explain how the X-Men got there. So, the concept is, and this, to my knowledge, was the first time this had been done, Marvel effectively canceled the entire X-Men line for 4 months and replaced every ongoing book with another book that was set in this reality. And when the solicits first came out, so this is when I had like a regular pull list and I was really regular at the comic store, when the solicits first came out, there was no indication that you were going to get the other books back. Like, Marvel really was playing this bluff that you were just going to live in the Age of Apocalypse from now on, the end, whatever. So how did that get set up? There was a plot running in the X-Men books where Legion, Professor X's son, who now we all know from his brilliant television series, who can kind of like have any power that he wants, goes back in time, and I think he's trying to kill Magneto, but something happens, and instead Xavier gets killed. So Age of Apocalypse is a whole response to like, what if there was a world without Charles Xavier? And it's really great. It's planned so well. Each of these series has 4 installments, and they thread with each other so nicely. Things are affecting other series from one series. They all have this like shared sense of history and continuity. It's really one of, it's like 40 some issues all told, and it's really one of the best executed events of that nature that Marvel has ever done, or that really I've read from any comic book company. And so you have to think, like, taking away Xavier, how much does that change things? For some characters, it doesn't actually change things too much. Of course, I mean, there is the ascendance of Apocalypse that happens as a result of there not being Xavier as this guiding force with the X-Men. But, like, are Cyclops still going to meet Jean? Like, what's going to happen with Iceman, Beast, and Angel? Is Wolverine going to get recruited? Is there going to be a school for gifted youngsters? Is Magneto going to be a bad guy? And spoiler, Magneto kind of winds up being a good guy from the start because he sees Xavier die and he decides that he wants to take up his cause. And so it's the Magneto school for youngsters. Unfortunately, there are just a couple of issues that are left out of this omnibus, and it was controversial at the time and now not so much in hindsight for reasons. So this had part of the X-Men lineup at the time was X-Men Unlimited, which was a quarterly book that told longer stories, and during this period that became X-Men Chronicles, and it told some background stories of the Age of Apocalypse that were really important and helped you understand the relationships between the characters. It's not in the omnibus, because the way that they play on the omnibus is it's just basically like what happens from when you get into the reality to when you leave the reality. So any kind of prequel story doesn't really fit into the concept of the omnibus, nor does anything that treats the reality as something that's ongoing, because for the purpose of this omnibus, the reality ends and you go back to the X-Men after, which is how we experienced it as readers at the time. So it's missing those series, which unfortunately are my favorite probably out of almost all of Age of Apocalypse, but it's gotten a reprint. It's really fun to read. But the tropes it's subverting, the natures of the characters it's subverting, it's very much having to do with understanding what the X-Men were in the 90s. And I think that without those X-Men Chronicle issues, it's hard to fine-tune your understanding of that if you don't understand what the X-Men were directly before that. So, like, what is so shocking about what's happening in Generation Next or what's happening in Excalibur in this crossover? Part of it is understanding what the X-Men were at the time. But in terms of, like, totally self-contained X-Men stories, this has got to be in the top group of them because it is so self-contained and because it's so meticulously planned out. It's not just like one sprint through a story like New X-Men or Astonishing X-Men. It's all these disparate threads and they're woven together so well. And I mean, I could go on and on. Now, Marvel has reawakened this reality on several occasions and also done prequels to it. We'll talk about that because there's another book that I didn't wrap up in this package called the Age of Apocalypse Companion that has those Chronicle issues and a lot of the things that Marvel later inserted before and after this. So on your bookshelf, the two of them together really gives you the complete experience. I love this run. It's wrapped because I have it in floppies and I've read it so many times. I just haven't gotten around to reading an oversized hardcover. But it's extremely complete and it's extremely self-contained, and the only thing you might need to know to appreciate it is just the general lay of the land of the X-Men from the 90s. So if you've read any Claremont Lee kind of X-Men, or if you remember any of that, I think you'll appreciate this. If you've never read any older X-Men, I think it might seem a little bit strange. It might be something you just want to sample digitally. It's also been issued in paperback at least twice, so you don't necessarily have to shell out for this omnibus, which I love. And I mean, this cover art. There's other cover art too, but this cover art, which I just think is super cool. So now for the official shelving of Marvel's Age of Apocalypse. Also, let it be said that Apocalypse really hadn't had that many chances to shine before that. He had his original X Factor throwdown, and then the X Factor throwdown right before X Factor the team got swallowed back up into Uncanny X-Men, and then also Executioner's Song. But we had seen relatively limited Apocalypse, so this was like the first time that we got the full scope of what he's trying to drive the Earth to, and it was extremely shocking. So that was one thing that was really cool about it as well. So thank you so much for tuning in, and finally, you know, I really love when I get my X-Men books, because that's what I really love and I have a history with, so I can like really get vehement. So thanks for tuning in to an installment where I got an X-Men book, and tune back in because there's a lot more X-Men books in this one, and also a lot of other Marvel as well, here at Crushing Comics. Show up.